The airplane felt smaller at night. Canvas and rivets hummed. Hot oil, rope, and men trying not to breathe too loud. Chalk numbers on helmet nets, hands resting on static lines. He recalls the message they received from General Eisenhower earlier. The eyes of the world are upon you. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. He looks into the dark and stays calm. He knows what he's doing. This isn't his first mission. He already knows the routine, the shoulder squeeze, the shuffle, the slap to the jumpmaster's arm, the step into nothing. He knows the hard tug when the chute opens, and he knows the real fear comes after landing. He knows this from Sicily. July 10, 1943. They jumped into flak and crosswinds scattered across cactus and rock. Friendly guns hit friendly planes, sticks landed miles off target. Even so, small groups formed on the move, cut roads near Gela, and helped blunt armored counterattacks at places like Piazza Ridge. Then there was mainland Italy. Salerno, September 14, 1943. The beachhead was buckling under German pressure. They were told to jump, fast, to reinforce the fight that could have pushed the Allies back into the sea. They landed among olive groves and stone walls, fought as shock infantry, and steadied the perimeter. They earned a reputation for showing up hard when the plan was thin. Now it's Normandy, June 6, 1944. The channel behind, France below, hedgerows stitching the country into dark rooms. He checks gear by touch, reserve, leg bag, knife, canteen, ammo. The cabin goes quiet in that way it does when veterans are in the stick. Flak erupts around them. Pilots jink. The plane illuminates with red light. We're closer now, he thinks to himself. The jumpmaster calls out, "Get ready, stand up, hook up, equipment check." Then the light turns green. He steps out into nothing and then yanks, the canopy snapping open. The ground rises fast. Pasture, a farmhouse, a dog barking in the distance, a tracer that misses by a hand's width. He lands, kills the shine of his chute, checks rifle and compass, and gets to work. The mission tonight is specific. Seize and hold the causeways over the Mer des River at La Fière and Chef du Pont, block German counterattacks toward Utah Beach, and secure ground around Sainte-Mère-Église. Scattered or not, the division needs to knit itself into a net across the roads and fields before dawn. Right now, he's alone. Then two shapes emerge from the dark, faces blackened out, gear rattling soft. "Flash," he calls out. Thunder echoes back. These were other paratroopers, and they form up, get their bearings, and proceed to the objective. This is what they learned the hard way in 1943. Move first, organized fast, and use the confusion to their advantage. These men are from the battle-hardened 82nd Airborne Division, America's other paratroopers. While the 101st will become the face of Airborne on film and television, the 82nd, by contrast, arrived in Normandy already blooded. 2 combat jumps behind them, a 3rd underway, and a long road still ahead. To understand why a paratrooper could stare into the Normandy dark and stay calm, let's rewind. The 82nd didn't learn that composure over France. It learned it in the year before, in the way the division was built, trained, and pushed into the air. The story starts with a patch from the last war, a reactivation order in 1943, and a line of volunteers who signed up to fight gravity before they fought the Germans. The AA Circle, the All-American patch, first appeared in 1917 at Camp Gordon, Georgia. The new 82nd Division pulled men from every state and fought hard in the Meuse Argonne and then deactivated in peacetime. On March 25th, 1942, a few months after Pearl Harbor, the Army reactivated the 82nd, initially as an infantry division at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. Within months, the plan changed. German airborne forces had shown what vertical envelopment could do. In 1940, gliders and paratroops cracked Fort Ibn Email and snatched bridges in the Low Countries. In 1941, Crete fell to parachute assaults. The British built their own parachute regiment and started practicing the same tricks. This led to American planners concluding that they needed forces that could deploy behind the front to seize bridges, road junctions, and airfields, disrupting reserves and preventing the line from reforming. Airborne units could also give the Army a fast, theatre-wide reserve, a force you could throw overnight at a choke point, hold for 24 to 48 hours, and meet with armor. It was decided that the 82nd would be converted from a regular infantry division to an airborne division. It already had a functioning headquarters at Camp Claiborne, staff that could plan and move big pieces, and a name the public knew from 1918, useful for recruitment. The call for volunteers went out across posts and training camps, hazardous duty, parachute pay, jump school at Fort Benning. The Airborne would pay soldiers an extra $50 a month on top of their salaries, which is equivalent to an extra $1,000 in 2025. Soldiers found different reasons to join. The money, the glory, the allure of being part of an elite unit. There was no shortage of volunteers. Trains brought them to Fort Bragg and the division began to take shape. There were farm kids and factory hands, clerks and coal miners, a scatter of college men who traded classrooms for barracks. In the ranks, a new vocabulary spread fast. Legs for anyone who wasn't airborne, Goonie Bird for the C-47 that would carry them, and a 4-word instruction that summed up the job: stand in the door. Then came jump school at Fort Benning. Candidates learned to fall before they learned to fly. Parachute landing fails, knees, hip, shoulder, repeated until the body stopped arguing. Mock doors taught the rhythm of exits. The 34-foot towers taught trust in a harness. Only then did the aircraft appear. 5 qualifying jumps, the first with a light load and the last with full combat gear that hit like a second man when the chute opened. By late 1942, the 82nd was officially airborne and practically restless. Companies practiced loading and sticks practiced timing. C-47 crews and paratroopers learned each other's habits, and pathfinders rehearsed with beacons and panels that would, in theory, mark drop zones no matter the weather. The all-American patch from 1917 stayed on the shoulder, but the meaning shifted. In World War I, it meant a division drawn from every state. In 1942, it meant a division that wanted to be first. First into a country, first onto a road junction, first to make a problem for the enemy where no problem had existed a minute earlier. Orders finally pointed them away from Carolina. Men finished their jumps, collected their wings, and rode troop trains north to ports and staging areas. The division would ship out in the spring of 1943. The calm you saw in a paratrooper's face over Normandy began here, on hot parade grounds, in tall harnesses, under instructors who barked "stand in the door." The division was ready to jump. Sicily was the 82nd's first real test. Operation Husky, the night of July 9th, 1943. The plan was straightforward. Drop paratroopers inland of Gela and Licata, seize the road net, and blunt the counterattacks that would try to throw the seaborne landings back into the water. C-47 formations crossed the Mediterranean into crosswinds that broke up spacing. Pathfinder beacons were late in some places and dark in others, and Allied gunners on edge fired at shapes they could barely identify, with many hitting their marks. Sticks scattered across cactus fields and stone terraces, and many men landed miles from the intended zones. Near Gela, elements of the 505th began choking the approaches in the first hours of daylight, felling telephone poles across lanes, pulling farm carts into choke points, wiring grenades into improvised obstacles, and laying ambushes. The ground that became legend inside the division was Piazza Ridge, a stretch of scrub and knuckleback terrain southeast of Gela. It was a mixed group, mostly 505th Parachute Infantry under James M. Gavin. They were on thin ammunition and thinner sleep when armor from the Hermann Göring Division came hunting. Through a long day, paratroopers rotated bazooka teams, shifted rifle squads to make a narrow front look deeper, and walked their guns from position to position to keep the optics of strength alive. The ridge held. If it hadn't, the beaches at Gela would have faced pressure they were not ready to withstand. Sicily also delivered a hard lesson about coordination. On the night of July 11th, another wave of transports brought in additional paratroopers. Allied naval and ground gunners, rattled by Axis raids, opened fire on friendly C-47s crossing the beachhead. Dozens of planes were hit, and some went down into the sea. By the end of the campaign, the 82nd had proved two things that would define its World War II record. First, dispersion wasn't defeat, if you moved fast toward key ground. Second, small units acting on clear intent could make a divisional footprint out of a handful of sticks. Sicily wasn't neat, but it was effective where it counted. 2 months later, Italy offered a different test at Salerno during Operation Avalanche on the nights of September 13th to 14th, 1943. The beachhead was under strain from German counterattacks, and the order to the 82nd was blunt. Get in fast, stiffen the line, and keep the landings from being shoved back into the sea. The 504th Parachute Infantry, under Colonel Reuben H. Tucker, led the reinforcement. They dropped into a patchwork of olive groves and vineyards behind the beaches near Paestum and the Sili Calore River corridor. There was no time to assemble for a textbook airborne maneuver. Paratroopers went straight to work as shock infantry, hauling ammunition from bundles, guiding scattered elements of the seaborne divisions to where they were needed, and building a defensive lattice around threatened approaches. By daylight, the extra rifles, machine guns, and a few hastily emplaced anti-tank pieces were already changing the tempo. German probes that had been chewing up ground met fresh resistance at walls and field corners that hadn't been defended an hour before. Platoons of paratroopers, spread thin, put steel in places that had been gaps. The line steadied and the beachhead held. Sicily had shown that the 82nd could arrive ahead of an invasion and make trouble where none existed yet. Salerno showed it could arrive inside a crisis and give commanders breathing room in a single night. The division left the Mediterranean with 2 jumps behind it and a sharper playbook than it had brought overseas. By early 1944, the division was scattered across camps in Northern Ireland and England, running night problems over hedgerow country, loading and offloading C-47s by the clock, and learning the names of small Norman towns that would soon matter a great deal. England gave them time to sharpen details and add in new faces. Replacements filled the 505th's ranks. The 507th and 508th took their places on the jump manifests, and the 325th prepared for a rough glider landing to follow. The mission was simple. Seize Sainte-Mère-Église, hold the Méderet crossings at La Fière and Chef du Pont, and block the roads that led to Utah Beach. On the night of June 5th, the camps went quiet in the particular way they do before a big operation. An officer would lift a flap on a blackout light, point at a road on the sand table, and ask, "What do you do if you land alone?" The right answer was the one drilled all year. Move toward the objective with whoever is near. Don't wait for perfect, make yourself useful now. The channel crossing was rough. Cloud, flak, and drift. Formations broke up. Some Pathfinder beacons worked, and others didn't or couldn't be found. pilots flew fast and low. Sticks dropped early, late, wide, and sometimes exactly where they were meant to. The Memoirs floodplain, swollen by open sluices, swallowed men who landed in the water loaded with gear. Others hit orchards, gardens, and lanes, tore down canopies in the dark, and started to thread the hedgerow country by compass and memory. Sainte-Mère-Église burned into visibility before the sun. A house fire in the square had pulled civilians and German troops into the open, and paratroopers from the 505th fell into the light like moths. A few died, suspended in trees and telephone wires. One trooper's chute snagged the church steeple. He played dead and lived. The first hours were chaotic, fighting in alleys, in doorways across the square. By dawn, Americans held the town. To the west, the Memoirs was a sheet of black water with narrow causeways raised just enough above the flood to be usable. At La Fière and Chef du Pont, paratroopers reached the crossings in scattered knots and began turning them into strongpoints. The ground there was cruel to attackers and defenders alike. A straight ribbon of road with no cover and fields that hid water beneath grass. German counterattacks started early. Infantry tested the approaches, then armor followed. The 82nd made thin lines look thick by moving squads between positions, by hauling 57mm anti-tank guns into better angles, and by placing bazooka teams where a shot down the road would matter most. Anything that could fire was put where it could be heard. A few moments stand out, even in a week that was nearly continuous contact. At La Fière, a small collection of paratroopers, men from different regiments, scraped together by whoever had the rank and breadth to do it, held the farm and the rise of the road against repeated pushes. Fire was traded back at point blank across hedgerow gaps. When an attack pinned a machine gun, a two-man team crawled forward with a satchel and opened a new mouth where the old one had gone quiet. When a 57mm gun ran dry, men carried ammo forward through water they couldn't see into, passing shells hand to hand like buckets in a barn fire. Normandy for the 82nd wasn't a single fight. It was a braid of small ones, each linked to a larger purpose. Causeways held, a town squared up and defended. Road nets choked so the 4th Infantry Division could come off Utah Beach and push inland. In orchards and along drainage ditches, paratroopers learned quickly which hedges ate bullets and which passed them, which lanes drew artillery and which were invisible. They learned how long you could hold a bend in a road with 2 machine guns and half a dozen rifles, and when to fall back 50 yards to make the next angle better. The price was heavy. Some paratroopers drowned in the flooded fields. Others were hit hanging in trees or drifting over roads they couldn't avoid. Friendly fire persisted in pockets where nerves outran identification. But the division that had trained to move first and organize fast did exactly that. Scattered sticks became squads. Squads became company fronts. Company fronts became a net across roads that the enemy needed. By the time the beachhead linked firmly with the airborne sector, the map looked very different from the neat arrows on the sand tables in England. Sainte-Mère-Église held, La Fière and Chef du Pont in American hands. German counterattacks blunted and pushed back, and Utah's exit routes open. Had those causeways fallen, troops landing at Utah wouldn't have been able to get off the beach and begin the liberation of France. The 82nd, blooded in Sicily and hardened at Salerno, kept them. From those held causeways in Normandy, the next lift sent the 82nd into daylight over Holland. By September, the Allied advance had outrun its logistics. Antwerp had been taken but not opened. The Siegfried Line barred the German frontier. The proposal was blunt: jump through the Netherlands, seize a chain of bridges over the Maas, the Waal and the Lower Rhine, and drive a single armoured corridor, Hell's Highway, into Germany. If it worked, the Allies would sidestep the fortifications and end the campaign before winter. The 82nd's tasks were specific. Secure the Groesbeek Heights, the high ground shooting the corridor's eastern flank, capture the bridge at Gave over the Maas, and help take Nijmegen bridges over the Waal. The jump was as clean as their commanders could hope. Dutch civilians waved from the roadsides as canopies opened over orchards and fields. The 504th moved fast and took Gave intact. The 505th and 508th climbed onto the Groesbeek Ridge and started digging a belt of foxholes and gun pits against counterattacks expected out of the Reichswald. Nijmegen was the hinge, and it didn't give easily. Urban defenses hardened by the hour, and patrols from the 508th tested approaches but found the south ends of the bridges too strong to take with what was on hand. Higher headquarters pressed the parallel priority: keep the ridge. If Groesbeek Heights fell, the corridor could be cut in half before it formed. The division fought on both fronts. On the ridge, companies from the 505th and 508th held villages and woodlines, Mürkbeek and small hamlets that pinned the map to the ground against infantry and self-propelled guns feeling for weak seams. The 325th Glider Infantry arrived by lifts on the 18th and 23rd and went straight into those woods east of Groesbeek, absorbing repeated blows to keep the shoulder firm so the road could live. In Nijmegen, the stalemate broke with a river crossing. On the 20th of September, the 504th shoveled canvas boats into the Waal under direct fire, ferried enough men across, and rolled up the north bank positions from behind, clearing the approaches to both the rail and road bridges. British armour pushed through the city from the south and surged over the spans. Afterwards, Nijmegen fell. Amid that week, one act stands out. On the 21st of September, near Oosterhout, First Lieutenant John R. Towle of the 504th took a bazooka forward against tanks and infantry attempting to punch a hole through the fragile American lines. He hit two tanks immediately in front of him, drawing the fire meant for the men behind him. Towle then fired into a nearby house containing 9 German soldiers, killing them all with one well-placed shot from his bazooka before he was mortally wounded. The attack unraveled because he stood, and he later received the Medal of Honor. The corridor was formed. Gave and Nijmegen were held, and the Groesbeek Heights stayed in American hands, but the operation failed. The last link, Arnhem, never fell. The 82nd did what it was sent to do: hold the ridge, keep Hell's Highway as open as a one-lane lifeline could be, and help take Nijmegen. But success at division level couldn't rescue a plan that depended on every bridge. The division came off the line as autumn closed. The next fight wouldn't come by air, but by truck into snow. Hitler bet on a last offensive, Wacht am Rhein, to split the Allies. The plan was to smash through the thin American line in the Ardennes, rush armoured spearheads to the Meuse, seize crossings, and drive on Antwerp. The attack hit before dawn on the 16th of December. Artillery rolled across the hills, outposts vanished, and reports of tanks came in from places that hadn't mattered the day before. The northern push aimed at the Meuse near Liege and Huy. Its spear point, Kampfgruppe Piper, was told to skip past resistance and grab bridges before engineers could drop them. The First Army's answer was immediate: commit the Theatre Reserve. The 18th Airborne Corps activated both of its divisions. The 101st to Bastogne, the 82nd to the northern shoulder to bar the routes to Liege and the Meuse. The job was to hold key ridges and road junctions, deny bridges, and buy time for armour to organise a counterpunch. Weeks after leaving Holland and refitting in northern France, the 82nd loaded onto trucks and drove into the Ardennes. Their destination was the high ground around Vermont, a ridge that touched every road that mattered in the sector. The ground was iron. Shovels bounced until engineers arrived with picks and a few sticks of TNT to start holes. Men lined shallow pits with pine boughs and learned to sleep in helmets because the treetops turned artillery into airbursts that shredded the air like sleet. Patrols went out at dusk, listening for engines, feeling for where the infantry screen was thin. When Kampfgruppe Piper's scouts nosed in, chargers lifted the spans into the air. Other crossings were blown or covered by fire. The 82nd's job was to make sure those bridges either disappeared or stayed American, and to close every side road that might let armor slip past. Nights were a braid of short moves and shorter bursts. Companies slid back 100 yards to get better angles, then stepped forward again at first light. Water came from melted snow, and medics followed the sound of breathing rather than orders. The weather punished everyone equally. Never quite bad enough to be a mercy, and never good enough to be a friend. Across the sector, regiments traded blows and ground. The 505th and 508 held the ridges and road nets toward Manet and Granmesnil, picking fields of fire that made a thin line look thick. The 504th helped slam doors along the Amblev. The 325th Glider Infantry fought woodlot to woodlot, spoiling attacks at dusk, handoffs under fire, and seams kept closed. Armor and tank destroyers dribbled in while positions hardened. By the 21st of December, this pattern had consequences. Bridges were denied, fuel was running out, and pressure from all sides coiled the column around La Glace. Within days, crews abandoned vehicles and slipped east on foot. The iron wedge that had scared every map in the first 48 hours lay rusting in the snow, its momentum spent on blown crossings and stubborn roadblocks. The offensive sagged. Pressure shifted toward the Manet-Granmesnil line as other German units tried to pry open the northern routes to the Meuse. The 82nd countered. By Christmas, the shoulder was firm and starting to straighten. By New Year's, coordinated pushes with attached armor and neighboring divisions pressed the line back to better ground. The town names shifted, Bras, Fosse, Granmesnil, but the work stayed the same. Clear a woodlot, reopen a road, step forward at dusk so you don't have to do it at dawn under observation. Historians draw a clean bulge on a map, but on the ground, the 82nd's piece of that shape was a ridge that didn't crack, bridges that didn't fall into enemy hands, road junctions that stayed American, and a chain of foxholes that held when holding was the entire job. They didn't jump into the Ardennes. They were ferried in by trucks and asked to hold against an overwhelming German assault, and they did, with the offensive breaking around them. As the war tipped toward its end and the Allies pushed into Germany, the 82nd refit and turned east with the First Army. There would be no last great jump. In March and April of 1945, they moved the way most units did, by truck, on foot, and over engineer bridges thrown across wide water. The farther east they moved, the more civilians they met going the other way. Carts, bicycles, everything bundled in blankets. Mixed among them were German soldiers who preferred an American cage to a Soviet march. Tennis courts and pastures turned into improvised stockades. Clerks suddenly had more work than riflemen, counting weapons, logging names, putting shape to the flow. Near Ludwigslust, patrols reached Wöbelin, a concentration camp. Prisoners were starving and many were beyond help. Medics and chaplains were pulled forward and rations were distributed. Local officials were made to see and to help bury the dead with dignity. The division's momentum stopped there. The work became witnessing and relief. Days later, the 82nd reached the Elbe. They were told to hold the west bank and watch the far side. Contact with the Soviets followed as they noticed figures in greatcoats on the opposite bank. Cigarettes and badges traded in broken phrases. Months earlier, they had carried bridges so US armor could cross. Here, they marked where the war would end. When the division finally stood still on the Elbe, the ledger of 2 hard years was plain. The 82nd had jumped into Sicily and Salerno, fought through Norman orchards for 2 thin strips of road over the Mediterranean, crossed the Waal under machine gun fire, held the northern shoulder of the Bulge in snow, and marched into Germany until the river said stop. The cost ran through every company roster. Men who didn't come back, men who did, and would never quite be the same. 2 years, 5 major campaigns, and a little over 9,000 casualties across the division, paid out in jumps, river crossings, and winters that never ended on time. When the division came home, it carried something worth more than decorations. People who could explain what it had felt like. James M. Gavin wrote it down, first in articles about airborne warfare, then in On to Berlin, a clear, unsentimental account of a division that had to learn in motion. Bob Murphy of the 505th wrote No Better Place to Die, a ground-level view of Lafayette that puts you into hedgerow mud and refuses to pretend there was anything romantic about it. Later, historians helped stitch the bigger picture. Clay Blair's Ridgway's Paratroopers, Phil Nordyke's All-American All the Way, the kind of books that turned scattered recollections into a map. So why didn't Hollywood follow the 82nd? It wasn't because their war was messier than the 101st, but because the 101st arrived with a package story at the perfect moment. Band of Brothers handed studios one company, one best-selling book, and living veterans to anchor it, backed by the producers of the highly successful Saving Private Ryan. Band of Brothers was approved and the show became an instant classic, cementing the 101st in the mainstream. There's also Bastogne, the town that made the 101st synonymous with the Bulge. The town is a 7-road hub that controls the Ardennes road net. When German armor surged west, holding Bastogne mattered to the whole offensive. The 101st was encircled for a week in deep cold, and answered our surrendered men infamously with nuts, and was relieved when Patton's 4th Armored Division broke through on December 26th. Newsreels and post-war histories locked Bastogne in public memory as the American stand of the Bulge, which in turn made 101st-centered projects easier to sell. By contrast, the 82nd's Bulge story was strategically crucial but harder to package. The northern shoulder was spread across Vermont, Trois Ponts, Cheneux, Manet, and Grand-Mesnil. It's the reason the Meuse didn't fall, but it lacks a single, instantly recognizable place name. Layer that on the production math. The 82nd's signature set pieces are big and scattered. Sicily's night drop, Lafayette's flooded causeways, the Waal crossing in daylight under direct fire, Rosbierk's woods, the frozen road net of the northern shoulder. They're spectacular, but expensive. If the screen needs faces and decisions though, the 82nd has them. Minutes where one choice bent to map, scenes that already carry their own dialogue, arcs that ran from training towers to riverbanks and winter roads. Take this, a patrol from the 325th Glider Infantry lay pinned west of Lafayette. Flooded fields on one side, a narrow lane on the other, and machine guns cutting the air flat. Private First Class Charles N. Dick Loper stood in it. He fired from the road, drawing the rounds that would have killed his friends. He bought them seconds to crawl back through a ditch that had become a trench of water. He kept firing until he could not. At Ampreville, Private First Class Joe Gandara, 507th Parachute Infantry, faced 3 machine guns locking a lane. He crossed open ground alone, silenced them, and fell doing it. The Medal of Honor found him decades later, when the paperwork matched what men had seen in a minute that wouldn't let them forget. At Lafayette, Bob Murphy of the 505th wrote the causeway fight the way it felt. No Better Place to Die reads like a camera strapped to a flooded road. Hedgerow water to the chest, MG-42 stitching the meadows, a farmhouse turned fulcrum. Shells passed hand to hand through black water. A straight ribbon of road that looked easy and proved lethal. The fight ran on inches. Machine guns shifted by the width of a hedgerow gap. Ammunition countered by touch, a boot vanishing when it stepped off the crown because the field was deeper than it looked. A ditch-level lens that makes the map honest. James Maggie Magellas, 504th Parachute Infantry, carried a platoon's tempo from Sicily to the Waal and into Heresbach. All the way to Berlin keeps the same small faces through rising stakes, farm lanes and roadblocks in the south, canvas boots shoved into a wide river in daylight, a winter sprint that stunned armor when surprise made weight. One image fixes the river crossing. Smoke tearing, paddles and hands working together, Major Julian Cook praying aloud, Hail Mary full of grace, as the first waves push off. The North Bank opens from behind. British armor clatters over spans that seemed too long to exist until the camera sits on steel. A leader's eye that turns short orders into ground gain. There's no shortage of stories ready for the lens if Hollywood chooses to look at the 82nd. A lone rifleman holding a Norman lane, boots clawing across the Waal in daylight. A winter farmhouse taken back in seconds. A glider skid in Dutch grass that ends in a foxhole on the Gesbjerg Ridge. The dialogue sits in citations and memoirs. The stakes are etched in maps, and the minutes were paid for by men who moved first and held last. The material is all already there. The 82nd marched into Berlin's Victory Parade, came home to Fort Bragg and took on a new peacetime identity, America's Guard of Honor. In 1965, the division jumped into the Dominican Republic to keep a civil war from spilling across the Caribbean. Paratroopers secured key intersections, stabilized the capital, and held the line while diplomats argued over maps. Vietnam pulled only part of the division. In 1968, after the Tet Offensive, the 3rd Brigade deployed. It patrolled cities and rice country, guarded airfields and roads, and learned the slow, grinding version of war that lives between ambushes and checkpoints before rotating home the following year. By the 1980s, the 82nd was the Army's quick reaction hammer. In Grenada, paratroopers seized airfields and helped steady a government in freefall. In Panama, they jumped again, landing on dark runways and rolling straight into Panama City to break a dictatorship's grip in a matter of days. The 82nd was among the first into Saudi Arabia for Desert Shield, and they became part of Desert Storm, pivoting with the 18th Airborne Corps into the left hook, sweeping across the western desert, seizing junctions and airstrips, guarding long supply lines as Iraqi units cracked. After 9/11, the pace only climbed. The division sent brigades and headquarters to Afghanistan and Iraq again and again, running sectors, training partners, fighting hard fights, and shifting between combat and advise and assist as the wars changed shape. When an earthquake shattered Haiti in 2010, paratroopers pivoted to relief, clearing runways, moving food and water, and turning a chaotic airfield into a lifeline. In the years that followed, units returned to Iraq to stiffen local forces against ISIS, while the division kept a brigade on hair-trigger alert as the Army's immediate response force. That alert posture showed up in news photos more than once. In 2020, after tension spiked in the Middle East, the 82nd was wheels up on short notice. In 2021, they led the tense final days at Kabul's airport, pulling families through the gates while the last aircraft lifted into the night. As Europe's security shifted, paratroopers moved forward again to the east, there to deter, reassure, and be present. The 82nd's airborne war didn't come from a single arc. It formed a chain. Sicily's scattered night drops cohered into roadblocks that bent counterattacks away from a beach. Salerno's emergency jump steadied a landing under strain. Normandy's first light revealed a church square in American hands, and inland, 2 narrow causeways held under unblinking fire so Utah Beach could breathe. Nijmegen's Waal was crossed in daylight in boats under direct fire to open the hinge of Market Garden. In the Ardennes, a thin northern shoulder was made to look heavy enough that Panzer spearheads ran out of bridges, fuel, and time. The habits that produced those outcomes became the division's identity. Move first, seize ground that matters, impose order on confusion, and refuse to let go. The All-American patch, born as a symbol of national composition in 1917, came to signify an airborne standard. First in, last to quit. That standard travelled well beyond 1945. The 82nd remained the formation selected when intent had to become movement quickly. The airborne story, most often dramatised on screen, centred on a siege with a clear brand and a compact geography. Bastogne. Strategically, the town's 7-road hub made it decisive within the Battle of the Bulge. For filmmakers, Bastogne concentrates the narrative, one battle space, recurring characters, and visible stakes, without jumping fronts or timelines. That resulted in the 101st Airborne of Bastogne becoming the default airborne narrative in film and television, while the 82nd, whose campaign spread across multiple theatres, was difficult to narratively discuss, only appearing in ensemble moments rather than as a spine. This imbalance reflects production logic more than historical weight. The 82nd's signature actions are large, dispersed, and technically demanding to recreate. Also missing is a sustained portrayal that connects them and lets the same faces age from Benning's Towers to the Elbe. Away from screens, the story persisted where it had always been strongest, among people. Reunions set maps on tables and made laughter outrun silence for a time. Museum glass held jump wings and a double A patch under soft light. Memoirs carried hedgerow mud and river current onto the page. Oral histories, recorded in ordinary rooms, fixed the tempo of combat more precisely than any montage. A date tapped on a pocket calendar, the sound of tracks somewhere in the dark, a minute that felt like an hour. The division's place in the present force is the natural extension of that past. It remains the unit held at short notice, tasked to move quickly and expected to hold key ground until mass arrives. The language around it changes. Immediate response force, global alert, but the function does not. The same habits that kept a causeway open in 1944 translate cleanly to airfields, road junctions, and crises that develop faster than headlines. The 82nd screen time hasn't matched its record. Not for lack of drama, but because its story resists a single pre-packaged arc. That imbalance is about narrative framing, not merit. The 101st's achievements, especially at Bastogne, are uncontested and central to how the Bulge is understood. But by any fair tally, the 82nd fought earlier and across more fronts. In the decades since, it has remained what that record made it. A formation trusted to move first, hold hard, and bring order to confusion. The canopy that opened over Europe didn't close on that habit. If future betrayals choose to match the history, the path is straightforward. Sicily's nights, Salerno's urgencies, Sainte-Mère-Igles and the Méderet, Nijmegen in daylight, the Groesbeek woods, the northern shoulder in the snow, and the Elbe's quiet. None of this subtracts from Bastogne, it complements it. Until then, the ledger stands on its own, earned in 5 campaigns, written in citations and rosters, and carried forward by a patch whose meaning has not changed. Across 5 campaigns and 4 combat jumps, the 82nd Airborne arrived early, held what mattered, and made outcomes possible. From Sicily's cactus to the Waal in daylight to a frozen shoulder in the Ardennes. It's one of World War II's most decorated divisions, decisive in Italy, France, Holland, and Germany, yet its story is too often a set piece on screen rather than the spine. This isn't about taking anything from the 101st, it's about widening the frame to match the history. So, what do you think? Is the 82nd overlooked in Hollywood? If you could greenlight one, which scene gets the full treatment? Piazza Ridge in Sicily? Lafayette's flooded causeways? The Waal crossing in broad daylight? Verbemont Trois Ponts on the Bulge's northern shoulder? Or the discovery at Vöbelen? And beyond the 82nd, which overlooked World War II units deserve the spotlight next? Drop your picks and your reasons in the comments. Bonus points if you've got a family story. As always guys, thank you so much for watching and I hope you learned something new.